please join me in a warm welcome for author Esther Perel.
Good evening. Would you have clapped if it was not on the New York Times bestseller list? So, let me just ask you, how many of you are currently in a relationship? And how many of you would like to be in a relationship? And how many of you would like to be out of the relationship you're in? At least on occasion. Thank you for your honesty. You see, we all live in relationships. We live in networks of relationships all the time. But if you think about friendship, it hasn't really changed too much in the last 150 years. If you think about sibling relationships, it hasn't changed that much. But there's one unit that has literally been transformed, and it's the couple. I'm a couples therapist. I've been a couples therapist for 34 years. It's a very new profession, because until not too long ago, it didn't really matter how well the couple was doing. The family came first, and the couple sacrificed for the preservation of the family. But everything has changed about coupledom today. And there is this little unit that has an all-time high in terms of relationship expectations, to do well, to be successful, to be competent, and often quite in isolation. Because in the village, in the past, you kind of heard every fight. The walls were quite porous. Today, you can have very close friends come to you and tell you that they are separating or divorcing, and you didn't even see it coming. So I decided that we needed to open up some of these hidden quarters of couples' lives. Nobody really knows what goes on backstage in relationships, and yet everybody could benefit from it, from understanding what are the raw, intimate exchanges that people actually go through. And I did it in two ways. One was by writing the book, The State of Affairs, and one was by doing the podcast. So what happened with this book is, one could say it's a book about infidelity, but one could also say it's a book about relationships through the lens of infidelity. Since I am in tech land, you don't learn much from just studying the Googles and the Apples. You learn from studying all of those that started and didn't make it. All the crises, all the disenchantments, all the disillusions, all the false hopes, all the false promises, the betrayals, the disloyalties, etc., the bad divorces. And so it's exactly that idea also that drove me through the writing of The State of Affairs, is that I'm going to use one of the worst crises couples can go through, and I will actually learn what makes for strength, for resilience, for thriving, for robustness. I'll do it the other way around. Not too long ago, when we lived in these small villages or communities, and some of you, it's just your grandparents, by the way, depending from where you come from, and I can't see you well. But in those villages, relationships were primarily dictated by rules and obligations. In the village, you didn't have to worry about figuring out what you want, because you didn't have the freedom to do what you want. You knew where you belonged. You know who you are, you knew your identity, you knew your roots, you know where you come from, and you know where you're going. So you have a good sense of continuity, but not much freedom. In the village, marriage was an economic enterprise. It was a pragmatic arrangement primarily, and it dealt with helping us satisfy our basic needs on the Maslow ladder, the survival needs, the food, the shelter, the housing, the survival, the economy, the family, the children, those kind of things. And in those marriages, by the way, you married for life. There was no exit. And if you were miserable, you could console yourself with an early death. That was the way out. In those marriages, monogamy had nothing to do with love. It was basically an imposition on women for economic reasons, in order to know whose children are mine and who gets the cows when I die. But it had nothing to do with love. It's very important to understand that. And it was primarily an imposition on women. It didn't have to do with a conviction. And there has always been a double standard about that. Men practically had a license to cheat, still do in many parts of the world. And then we were very wise to come up with all kinds of evolutionary and biological theories to explain why men's nature is that they have to roam. And we came up with other theories to explain why women are domesticated creatures that never want to go anywhere. Which didn't really make sense to me, because if she doesn't want to go anywhere, why is she locked up everywhere? So it's like a friend of mine once said, and that actually happened. He said, it's like Saudi Arabia. Give the woman a car, and then we will know what she really wants to do. From that place, infidelity was an economic threat. That was the primary thing. And it was primarily a threat on the women who were possessions of men, and so were their children. And this is not too long ago. Over a very short amount of time, we moved to the cities, and a number of major societal transformations take place all at once. Urbanization, the rise of individualism, the rise of romantic love and industrialization, all of it. And as we move to the cities and we enter the romantic era, we also begin to have all kinds of choices. We become free agents, or so we think. We have new choices, new options for things that we never chose. And for the first time, I am more free, but I'm also more alone. And when I am more alone, my relationships need to begin to embrace a different level of connection that isn't just about the base survival, but that is also about intimacy, which used to be primarily a byproduct of relationships, and it gradually becomes the center of the relationship. And intimacy, which until then basically meant we like fiddle on the roof. Remember, do you love me? And she says, what do you mean, do I love you? I washed your clothes, I milked your cows, I fed your children. If that ain't love, what is? Well, it's called domesticity at best and oppression, usually. You know, but that was the concept. Now we move and we redefine this term, and intimacy becomes into me see. And into me see means that me, the individual, needs you to see me. And how will you see me? By my sharing with you my most prized assets. And they're no longer my herd and my land. They are my interior life. I'm going to share with you my feelings and my aspirations and my dreams and my anxieties. And when I talk to you, you are going to reflect back to me. You are going to make me feel that I am heard. You are going to validate me. And I am going to momentarily transcend my existential aloneness. Into me see. So marriage becomes organized around love and the other things still, but now we add to it love. And not only do we add love to marriage, but we add sex to love. And primarily thanks to the democratization of contraception, that is the most important shift that took place. The women's movement, the gay movement, major revolutions, each in their own right. Sexuality is taken out of the soul world of biology, and it becomes for the first time socialized. It is no longer just a part of who I am, but it becomes an expression of what I do and who I am. It's no longer just a part of my condition, it becomes a part of my identity. Sexuality had always been primarily an economic asset. It was for procreation primarily, and it was a woman's marital duty. Within the context of marriage, passion has always existed, but it was somewhere else. In fact, the more pragmatic the marriage was, the more adultery was the space for love. Once we brought love into marriage, adultery became the space of betrayal and transgression. Sexuality becomes rooted in desire. Because I want to, and I want you to want me, and I want to want you. And we should all have wanted this wanting do at the same time, and with each other, and for 18 years, and 36, and 45. This notion of rooting sexuality in desire is very fickle. It's very different than when, we're in a Jewish building, when you're told, you must. When you must, you do. And you don't really wonder, do I feel like it? Don't I feel like it? Is it a good day? No, I did it yesterday. It doesn't matter. I can wait another week. You obey. You obey. You're not busy checking yourself. It's a very different mood. And not only this, does the meaning of sexuality totally change, and it now becomes about connection and pleasure. So we have brought love to marriage. We brought sex to love. And then we bring happiness down from the heavens to the earth. Ba'olam haba, it used to be happiness, the reward you get for having had a good life of suffering on earth. We decide that we can be happy, and it's not just an option, it's a mandate. You have to be happy. And you have to be happy in your marriage. Hence, we no longer divorce because we are miserable or unhappy. We divorce because we could be happier. The threshold totally shifts. And then not only do we do this thing with happiness, but we also bring consumerism into the picture. And consumerism makes it so that it's not that we have any more desires than our grandmothers had, but we definitely feel more entitled to pursue our desires. I deserve to be happy. That is in the background of the mind of infidelity. I deserve this. I'm deprived. It's been so long. I'm not going to finish my life like this. Is this it? Is there more? Those questions. They have been there forever. But there was a generation, and many, many generations, that thought those are the thoughts that you live and die with. Those are not the ones you act on. And so our sense of agency and entitlement really shifts. And then a number of other major changes take place. We used to marry and we had sex for the first time. Today we marry and we stop having sex with others. We used to talk about monogamy as one person for life. Today we talk about monogamy as one person at a time. And many of you, I'm sure, have said, I am monogamous in all my relationships. Plural. Do you understand what changes those mean, right? And then we also began to, with the secularization of the Western world, we began to look for the one and only. And the one and only used to mean God. Today, the one and only is the person that I'm looking for. It's my soulmate. And when we talk about the soulmate, we conflate the spiritual and the relational. And as this psychoanalyst Robert Johnson says, what we wanted, that we looked for in the realm of the divine, transcendence, ecstasy, wholeness, belonging, we now seek in the realm of our intimate relationships. Meaning that I am looking for the perfection of earthly love with my partner, for that stuff which I used to look for in the sanctuary up there. And this one and only is a different thing to find when you are living in the shtetl and you have to choose between 3 or 4 people, versus when you are at the fingertips of on your phone and you have 1,000 people available on the spot. This one and only is not who can I make a life with. This one and only becomes who is going to cure me of my FOMO. Who is going to be so captivating and so extraordinaire that I'm no longer going to think I could do better. There may be more. There's someone else that I haven't yet. Let's click again or swipe or whatever we do. Yeah? And this person, this one and only, is the one for whom I'm going to delete my apps. Now that's the true sign of commitment. And this one and only is also the person for whom exclusivity is going to mean that for you, my beloved, I renounce all others. Exclusivity means something very different when your life partner is your first partner and when your life partner becomes the one for whom you renounce all other options, or a range of options at least. And all of this has happened in a few decades. Plus, we live with a hedonic treadmill, so that when I finally think I found the thing I want, since I'm on the pursuit of happiness, I think there needs to be more. And so I keep searching the whole time. It's that background that was really occupying me as I began to look at, so what does infidelity represent these days? What do we mean when we say infidelity? And there is no universally agreed upon definition. That's the first thing to know. This is very culturally embedded. And does it mean, it used to be very clear. Infidelity meant that there's a child that is born and that the color of that child's hair is not mine. So we knew when the transgression took place. There was a clear sign. But what is it today? Staying secretly active on your dating apps? Watching porn? A chat room? A massage with happy endings? Where are we? The definition keeps on expanding. And it's never been easier to cheat, and it's never been harder to keep a secret. Because you can have a range of experiences online that are physical without being sexual, or that are sexual, the reverse, that are sexual without being physical. Because you have a whole range now of reality in between fantasy and reality, in which the kiss that you only imagine giving is as powerful as if there was a real kiss. Everything else is the same experience. Everything is imaginary except the relationship itself. So I've dealt with what is the definition. And before I even dealt with what is the definition, I had to deal with the fact that here is this subject. May I ask you something, people? How many of you would say that you have been affected by the experience of infidelity in your life? In your life. Meaning that you can be the children of a parent who was unfaithful, or a parent who left because that parent fell in love with someone else, or you are the person whose shoulder is wet because a friend has been crying on it for days on end, or you are the person who is a confidant to someone who's in the thralls of one, or you are the person who is in the triangle and who completes it as the lover. How many of you would say you've been affected by the experience of infidelity in your life? Okay, what I'm trying to say is this. It's systemic and it's intergenerational. It's not a story of two people. It's a much broader piece. And yet, this is probably the last taboo. It's shrouded in secrecy and shame. And the conversation about it, especially in this country, is particularly black and white, judgmental, and likes to criminalize it in terms of victims and perpetrators. As far as I know, it's not illegal. It's hurtful, it may be morally wrong, but it's not yet crime. It used to be, So to just touch the subject becomes very, very provocative. The minute you're not saying it is prohibited, it is the worst, it is always wrong, it can never do anything good, and there is only one bad person, and it's the one who betrays or cheats or strays, because there is no morally neutral language for this. Only in the arts you will say it's a love story. In the social sciences, the word love doesn't appear. It's about lying, deception, cheating, betraying, perfidy. It's a whole range of behaviors, but nobody ever thinks of it as actually having also a connection. That's one type of affairs. There's loads of infidelities, of course. So I will try to understand this. I try to understand it from the position of all the people that are involved in the story. And it's very important to say that understanding doesn't mean justifying. And not condemning doesn't mean condoning. But since about 80% of this audience was affected by this experience, and this is the case in every audience I'm talking to, I think that we need a conversation that is more caring and more compassionate for all involved. So for the children to understand their parents, for the friends to understand each other, etc. It's 20 years since the Clinton Lewinsky scandal, which is kind of where I began to think about this whole stuff. I had never dealt with sexuality before. I was a cross-cultural psychologist, and I dealt with how relationships change with big cultural changes. I looked at how migration changes the way we relate, particularly in terms of gender roles and child rearing. I looked at how intermarriage changes us. I looked at the changes of political regimes, the fall of communism, and so far, the digital. But this was a new take, Because what struck me, the question I had is, the data, the 2013 Pew poll basically says that in this country, people condemn infidelity more than they condemn divorce, cloning, suicide. 91%. And that's a very interesting finding because the rest of the world has typically opted differently. The world that is more collectivist, in which there is less of the centrality of the individual, has often opted to preserve the family and to compromise around infidelity. So I was always wondering, why were people so tolerant about multiple divorces and so intransigent about infidelity? And was it related to the fact that there was only one clear point of view? There is one dominant narrative of understanding the experience of infidelity. And could there be more than one? This is way too complex and way too ubiquitous to only look at it as a one-size-fits-all. So one of the other things that changed is that if I'm the one and only, and I'm the one and only today means that it's one person for everything, right? Meaning, you, my partner, are going to be with me everything that traditional relationships were about. Companionship, economic support, family life, social status. But you are also going to be my best friend, my trusted confidant, my passionate lover, my equal parent, the co-cleaner of the house, my inspiration for my career. You are going to be one person to give me what once an entire village used to provide. When you cheat on me, when you betray me, when your heart goes elsewhere, you bet it's not just hurtful, it becomes traumatic. Because now I have lost my best friend. Now I don't know anymore who I am. Now we have shattered the grand ambition of love. After all, I'm not that special. I'm not unique. I'm not indispensable. I'm not irreplaceable. Who am I? And infidelity has always hurt, but it wasn't always traumatic. Because people had diversified lives in which they had parts of themselves in multiple relationships. They had extended families, they had large networks, they had communities. But when it's one and only, and that one and only does it to me, what's left? Now, not only don't I know what I am and who I am, but I don't trust my entire life. Now my whole marriage is a lie. My whole marriage is a fraud. And when I say marriage, I mean committed relationships. This is true, heterosexual, homosexual, gay, straight, But that notion that this story now stands to redefine our entire 27 years together, this becomes the ultimate truth. And not only is this the ultimate truth, but I can't trust you anymore. And I can't trust neither you, nor can't I trust myself, because where's my perception? I don't trust that what I see is what is. My entire sense of reality has been shattered. So the isolation on the part of the people who are on the receiving end of this ordeal is enormous. And it is even more enormous given today the pressure to get out. Since divorce is the dignified solution, the big shame, it used to be that divorce carried all the shame. Today, choosing to stay when you can leave is the new shame. So not only have you betrayed me and lied to me and I'm heartbroken by you, but on top of it, I can't talk about it with anybody. So now I'm lying for you to protect you, the one who hurt me, so that they won't be upset at me for still loving you. That's the toxic shame. You follow me? And then I took on, so there's a whole part of the book. The whole first part is actually looking at the experience of the person who is hurt and who is on the receiving end of this. But let me read you a little bit, just to change. At this very moment, in all corners of the world, someone is either cheating or being cheated on, thinking about having an affair, offering advice to someone who's in the throes of one, or completing the triangle as a secret lover. No aspect of a couple's life elicits more fear, gossip, and fascination than an affair. Adultery has existed since marriage was invented, and so too the taboo against it. It has been legislated, debated, politicized, and demonized throughout history. Yet, despite its widespread denunciation, infidelity has a tenacity that marriage can only envy. So much so that it is the only sin that gets 2 commandments in the Bible. One for doing it, and the other just for thinking about it. In every society, on every continent, and in every era, regardless of the penalties and the deterrents, men and women have slipped the confines of matrimony. Almost everywhere people marry, monogamy is the official norm, and infidelity the clandestine one. So what are we to make of this time-honored taboo, universally forbidden and universally practiced? The revelation of an affair can be so wrecking, it is no surprise that most people want to take sides. Whenever I tell someone I'm writing a book about infidelity, the immediate reaction is usually, are you for or against? As if there are only 2 options. My answer is yes. Behind this cryptic response lies my sincere desire to initiate a more nuanced and less judgmental conversation about infidelity and its concomitant dilemmas. The intricacies of love and desire don't yield to simple categorizations of good and bad, victim and culprit. To be clear, not condemning doesn't mean condoning, and there's a world of difference between understanding and justifying. But when we reduce the conversation to simply passing judgment, we are left with no conversation at all. We are also left with no room for people like Benjamin, a mild-mannered gentleman in his early 60s who approached me after a talk in Los Angeles to ask, is it still called cheating when your wife no longer knows your name? My wife has Alzheimer's, he explained. She's been in a nursing home for the past few years, and I visit her twice a week. But for the past 14 months, I have been seeing another woman. Her husband is on the same floor. We have found great comfort in each other. Benjamin may be one of the nicest cheaters I've ever met, but he's by no means alone. Plenty of people care deeply for the well-being of their partners, even while lying to them. Just as plenty of those who have been betrayed continue to love the ones who lied to them and want to find a way to stay together. For all these people, I am committed to finding a more compassionate and effective approach to infidelity. People often see an affair as a trauma from which there is no return, and indeed, some affairs will deliver the fatal blow to a relationship. But others may inspire a change that was sorely needed. Betrayal cuts to the bone, but the wound can be healed. Affairs can even become a generative experience for a couple. And because I believe that some good may come out of the crisis of infidelity, I have often been asked, so, would you recommend an affair to a struggling couple? My response, a lot of people have positive, life-changing experiences that come along with terminal illness. But I would no more recommend having an affair than I would recommend getting cancer. How are you doing? So, the next thing that really stood out for me was that the model, the dominant model, is really back again to this one and only. Meaning, if you have found the one and only, and if you have everything that you need at home, then there must be no reason to go looking elsewhere. Hence, if you are going to look elsewhere, it must mean that there's something missing. And either there's something missing in your relationship, or there's something missing in you. But by definition, it's a deficiency model. It's a symptom model. And while that model, of course, is true in so many cases, and people mind the meanings and their motives of their straying in all kinds of discontents related to the relationship, from loneliness to chronic resentment to sexual frustration to the tiresomeness of rejection and indifference, lots of things. But the big surprise for me was that infidelity and affairs occur in good marriages, in bad marriages, in open relationships, in monogamous relationships. It doesn't really matter. They happen. And often, they have nothing to do with the relationship. They actually happen in relationships that are often quite satisfying. You know, when I wrote Mating in Captivity, the thing that really interested me was people who came to my office and said, we love each other very much, we have no sex. And I began to understand what is the dynamic between love and desire. How do they relate and how do they conflict? Because it would not have been interesting to write a book about people who can't stand each other and don't want to touch each other. That's kind of an obvious thing. And even that's not always the case. But the same thing happened here. People would come in again and again and say, I love my partner, I love my life, I love my kids, my family, I don't want to change any of it, I'm having an affair. And now I had to begin to ask myself, what's going on? And I began to hear this refrain. Every time, all over the world, if I ask people about their experiences with infidelity, which I went from India to Israel to Turkey to Argentina, I just went around. And there's one word that kept coming back everywhere. It had nothing to do with sex. It had to do with feeling alive. And feeling alive began to put in my mind that affairs, infidelities, are acts of transgression. They're acts where people break the rules, sometimes their own rules for that matter, often experiencing deep conflicts between their own values and their behavior. But often, while affairs are at the same time about hurt and betrayal and lies and deceptions and secrets, they are also about longing and loss and self-seeking. And I began to think that sometimes when in those types of relationships, when a person goes looking elsewhere, it isn't because they're looking for another partner, but it is more because they're looking for another version of themselves. And it isn't that they want to reject the person that they're with as much as they want to reject the person that they have themselves become. And that begins a whole different narrative. So I began to think, yes, even happy people cheat. It's a shortcut. It's not happy people, but it's even people who live in happy relationships. And that starts to make you go in a very different direction. So a lot of the questions these days have to do with sexual infidelities versus emotional infidelities, that whole conversation. And there was another word that I would often hear a lot, particularly in the elaborate rationalizations of the people who dissociate into these alternative utopian universes called their affairs. And that word was, nothing happened. Nothing happened is the common refrain of the sexual literalists. After a few too many drinks at his co-worker Abby's birthday party, Dustin accepted her invitation to stay over. When quizzed about it the next day by his girlfriend, Leah, he repeated those two words insistently. All right, since you must know, we slept together in the same bed. But I'm telling you, exactly. So I ask, at what point does something happen? Leah, meanwhile, is plagued by her own questions. Did they get naked? Did she sleep in his arms? Did he brush his nose against her sleeping face? Did he get hard? Is that really nothing? These stories make a critical point. Many affairs are less about sex than they are about desire. The desire to feel desired, to feel special, to feel seen and connected, to compel attention. All these carry an erotic frisson that makes us feel alive, renewed, and recharged. It is more energy than act, more enchantment than intercourse. And even when it comes to the act of intercourse, the adulterous defense system is impressively agile at finding loopholes. People go to great lengths to take the sex out of sex. My colleague Francesca Gentile compiled a list of some of the most imaginative completions to the sentence, "It wasn't sex because I didn't know her name. No one came. I was drunk or high. I didn't enjoy it. I'm not sure I remember the details. It was with a gender I don't usually have sex with. No one else saw it. We still had our clothes on. We still had some of our clothes on. One foot was on the floor. You can't make this shit up, I'm telling you. There isn't one word in this book that I made up. What I can say is, I am absolutely sure of nothing, but nothing is invented. And this level of rationalization and dissociation, when people are in it, they actually believe what they're saying. Afterwards, they can't believe they ever said something like this. When the thing cracks, you're aghast. You're aghast by your own behavior. I wish I had thought of it, but I would have played you a piece of the podcast, because you hear the conversation, the raw, vivid exchange around this, of what happens when you sit in front of the hurt, broken, shattered face of the person that you're with, and you know it's you who did it. So I began to think, okay, we need two things. We need a dual perspective, that's for sure. The dual perspective means it's about betrayal and it's about hurt, but it's also often about growth and exploration and all those things. But we can't put that up in front. In the beginning, I'm thinking about what happens in the revelation, in the aftermath of the revelation of an affair. And some affairs are break it, done. The relationship was already dying on the vine. But some affairs are remake it. And the line that has helped my patients the most, which I one day threw out as a joke about my own marriage, became really the line that, how you say in English, le fil conducteur, the thread that took me, which is this: most people in the West these days are going to have 2 or 3 adult relationships, committed relationships, marriages in their lifetime. Some of us are going to do it with the same person. And the affair sometimes is the end to the first marriage. And then the question is, do you want another one with each other? It won't be the same one. But you know what? It may even become a better one. And that idea that people in the aftermath sometimes start for the first time to have conversations with a level of depth and openness and honesty that they haven't had in years, if ever. You wish people would have these conversations in the beginning. But in the beginning, I'm with my one and only, with whom nothing is missing, since it's the one and only, so I can't have the conversations. It's really a bad bind. But for those who choose to stay together, there is a sequence of events that we have to go through that have to do with what happens when we experience that kind of shattering from within. And it does have to do with the acknowledgement of the hurt. Like in any traumatic experience, people need to know that the person who hurt me can acknowledge that it happened. Otherwise, I'm alone with my own reality. As long as you deny it, or you minimize it, or you deflect it, or you say, must we talk about this once again? Yes, we do. Because your nightmare may just have ended, but this person's nightmare has just begun. And we do. And the person is not asking you the same questions 1,000 times just to annoy you. The person is asking you the questions 1,000 times because they're trying to piece back together 1,000 pieces. And especially these days, where I'm not just finding a little bit of lipstick, or a little receipt. No, these days I can plunge into the digital archive and read 5,000 texts. That's a death by 1,000 cuts. How do I believe you afterwards when you tell me you want to be with me? I've just heard you say the same thing to somebody else again and again and again. So anyway, for the therapists in this room, this is not for the faint of heart. This is a real trench that you enter and you stay there for quite a while. But as much as you ask the same questions over and over, there are better questions than others. The questions that mind the sordid detail and keep you awake at night with an imagination that is often more lascivious than what your partner actually may have engaged in, they're not useful. The questions that are not detective but that are investigative are the ones that help you understand. Why did this happen? What does it mean? What does it say about us? Where do we go from here? How do we rebuild? And that's the second phase. What it did to you and what it meant for me. And then from there, what will be the vision for the future? There's no doubt that every affair will redefine a relationship. But every relationship will redefine define what the legacy of the affair will be. And today, it is one of the leading causes of divorce. To relationships that have often been good relationships. But if we keep this betrayal as the hegemony of all betrayals, and it sits on top of everything else, then we will not do service to the hard work that people have done for decades before. There is the group of chronic philanderers. I've seen them. But the majority of the people that come into my office, of course the others go to the lawyers, so I don't see them. But the ones who come to my office, and I'm actually going to do my first conference with matrimony lawyers. You know, I'm dying to see how they think about this thing. You know, here in California. But, you know, now I lost my train of thought. Yes, those people, they often have been perfectly faithful and monogamous for years, decades. And they one day cross a line that they never thought they would cross. And so I always asked, why would you risk losing everything for a glimmer of what? What is that longing that makes you become, you know, completely at odds with everything you once represented? And those people don't get enough airtime. We tend to go for the Trumps and the Weinsteins and all those people. And, you know, those are not, Weinstein is not about infidelity. That's the least of the problems. You know, so this idea that you don't demonize the person, but you actually try to understand what happens in the long story of relationships, especially when we live twice as long, it's very challenging. It's much easier to think this is the saint and this is the villain. But when you really understand the complex layers of relationships, it's important to know that the victim of the affair is not always the victim of the marriage. Yeah? It's like, I always think of this man. He comes up to me as the, you know, who's like, oh, slut, you bitch, you this, you that, you do. And I'm thinking, you have been so fucking mean to this woman for so many years. This is how I think. This is not how I talk. You know, maybe you haven't had one because you're not nice enough. You know, but it's like, I just had to say to him, you know, I totally understand your rage and everything you're experiencing in this moment, but just know one thing, betrayal comes in many forms. You have society on your side, and so you can be here morally superior to her because she's the one who strayed. How you refused her, how you neglected her, how you put her down, how you never say a kind word to her, that is supposed to be just normal marital misery. You know, intimate terrorism. All right. Are these in order, or do I have to select them? They're in order. Maybe. Can you talk about the subject of staying for the sake of the kids? Yes, of course. What is there to say? So much. You want to wake up with them. You want to put them to bed. You want to be there. And sometimes that's the choice you make. And then you have to contend with a partner who may ask you, are you staying for me? Or are you staying for the kids? And in our romantic version, I don't want you to just be there because A, it's comfortable, 2, you like the lifestyle, 3, you want to be for the family. I want you to have me as the first reason for why you're here. We are really romantic. Here's the thing. A lot of couples therapy. I'm a couples therapist, but I have a lot of things to say about couples therapy, is adult babysitting. I'm often number 4, 5. I'm not the first one. And there's a way that certain people who stay for the children and stay torn. It's a very difficult decision. Why? Because this is what I said to you early on. Today, we feel entitled to pursue our desires. The question itself is what matters most, my personal happiness or the needs of my children? And the fact that we sit with that question, what is my obligation to the others versus my obligation to myself, are some of the most profound questions of individualistic societies. The other societies don't have that question. The answer is imposed upon you. If you want the freedom, you have to deal with that ambivalence. And it is one of the most difficult value conflicts you will face. I think I've said what I had to say about this. What's my perspective on consensual non-monogamy? How does this relationship structure relate to infidelity? Look, those are two very different conversations for me. In the conversation about infidelity and the conversation about consensual non-monogamy. I mean, of course, infidelity means you broke the monogamy contract, at least the explicit monogamy contract, the official one. But the 3 constitutive elements of infidelity, the main one is secrecy. There is no infidelity without the secret. It's the secret that organizes the whole thing. And the relationship lives in the shadow of the affair, and the affair lives at the center of the relationship. It's a triangle. Consensual non-monogamy is a whole different story. It's basically people today trying to reconcile 2 different sets of values. The value for commitment and stability and security and predictability, and the value of self-expression and self-actualization. The conversation about monogamy today is the conversation about virginity 60 years ago. 60 years ago, premarital sex would have had exactly the same reactions as many people have today about non-monogamy. But consensual non-monogamy are people who basically want to find alternative models to make a relationship stronger, maybe lasting, but definitely stronger and healthier and more respectful of the needs of 2 individuals. And it wants to marry a structure in which there is the commitment to the other and the commitment to the self, and the self-actualization. People in consensual non-monogamy relationships, actually, I just read a very interesting study. It looked at 5 criteria: satisfaction, passion, commitment, jealousy, and trust. Consensual non-monogamy relationship, or polyamory relationship for that matter, polyamorous relationships, pretty much matched the monogamous relationships when it came to satisfaction, to passion, and to commitment. There's not really any difference. The differences that were really interesting was around jealousy and trust. There was more jealousy in monogamous relationships. Now, that may be explained in a number of different ways. One is there's much more conversation about jealousy and the recognition of the existence of jealousy in non-monogamous relationships, ethically non-monogamous relationships. But the other part is maybe also that people who engage in consensual non-monogamy are people who often come with a more secure attachment. People who have anxious attachments should not deal with that. That's not for them. For them, it's plenty to have a good dose of reliable, secure, safe life to be in. So I don't know if it's the personality that determines it or if it's the interaction between the 2 people, but it's quite interesting to notice. And the second one is there is more trust in the consensually non-monogamous couples. Probably because things are out in the open and talked about plenty of times. A lot of the people who engage in in seeking other ways of being in relationships today are often, after all, the children of the boomers, and the boomers are basically the divorced and the disillusioned. So all the credit to people who are looking for what are the multiple ways we can be together. We are clear that there can't be a one-size-fits-all. And marriage today, you know, if Apple sold you a product that failed 50% of the time, would you buy it? So when people say that doesn't work, I'm always thinking this works so well. We don't know what works. We all are looking and seekers, and we are irrational people with field of inconsistencies and deep needs, and we just do the best we can to find it in varieties of models, and we live twice as long. What is your comment on the Me2 campaign, where women are coming and expressing their intolerance of being harassed? How much shall I talk about this? All the way. Whenever this begins for me, not that the soul doesn't exist in plenty of other places, but I am clear that the culture of sexual conduct and misconduct in this country is rooted in some fundamental ideas that are really problematic. For example, sex is a risk factor. Sex is the risk factor. It's not the same as many European countries for whom sex is a natural part of life. Being irresponsible is the risk factor. If being irresponsible is the risk factor, then you have education that teaches people how to be responsible. We have sexual and relationship education that starts in kindergarten. The majority of money that has gone to sex education in America, millions, have been for abstinence campaigns. And the abstinence campaigns basically have led to the situation where Americans have onset of sexual activity 2 years earlier than the liberal Dutch. You have more STDs than 30 of the developing countries, including the EU, and more teen pregnancy. This is the only Western country that doesn't have a public health policy on adolescent sexuality. So this whole package enters into a culture of violence. It's a culture that does not recognize sexuality, but it has no problem with violence. And the violence is often male-driven. It's a masculine violence, from the harassment all the way to Vegas. And I don't think you can separate those two. It didn't, you know, Freud said it, but it's been said many, many times before. Aggression and sexuality have a connection. So the notion of coming out around having been harassed, around having been uncomfortable, I get it. I get where it comes from, and I also, you know, the next question, of course, that links to that is the Weinstein question to begin with. Weinstein is not a story of infidelity. You know, for most of history, people were sinners. Today, they no longer have a sin. Today, they have a pathology. And the pathology is sexual addict. So we medicalize the problem so that we don't have to deal with the moral and the behavioral and the ethical ramification of people's behaviors. Go spend $40,000 in a rehab. You're not an unfaithful person. You may have been unfaithful to your wife, but you're a predator and you're a sex offender. That's criminal. Infidelity is not criminal. Assaulting people and coming and are acts of violence and aggression. So that's it. To me, this is very important, but if something doesn't change systemically, it just will happen again and again and again. And the only difference is that today we know more about it. It's not like it didn't exist, but it doesn't change it fundamentally. You know, as long as health classes are not integrated and it's the boys in one class and the girls in the other, then these people will look at each other without understanding any of the nuances and the ambiguities of interdynamics. And then you put these boys who are now, as of age 11, primarily getting their education from porn, so they really know not much. This is all part of a culture. It's not, you can't identify one thing. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like, voilà, that's that. I mean, you know, they arrive at college and they have to write a consent signature. Suddenly, after not knowing anything for so many years, suddenly you sign I understand consent. From where? Have you been in interaction with people? Have you learned the codes? Have you understood hedging? Have you understood not being sure, coming in, coming out, pacing, not wanting, not sure that one wants, wondering, can I want? What kind of implications does it mean when I want? What will people think about me? Maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I'm going to go. No, I'm going to stay. That's what happens in your adolescent sexual education. Those ambiguities help you deal with consent. And then from consent comes assault and the whole sequence of things. How do you heal from being cheated on? It depends, first of all, if you're staying with this person or if you're not. That's two separate stories. But in both cases, so that's first of all. It's not the same story if you choose to stay with your partner and if you don't. And then if you choose to stay with your partner, are you going to become... There's three main groups of outcomes for those who stay together. When I say there is, it just means I wrote it up like that. There's nothing evidence-based about it. Let's be very clear. It's a way of organizing thousands of cases because that's how I got to learn. If you just ask questions that lead to statistics, you don't know much about what goes on in this piece of people's lives. So I organized it in three outcomes. Outcome one is the supplicants. The supplicants are people who stay together, but they basically are gnawing at the same bone for the next 20 years. And every time you're 5 minutes late, I'll remind you, because you have used up your entitlement quota. And I'm going to remind you of that. And I'm also not going to touch you, because at the moment I get close to you, I'm going to have to feel like I'm letting you get away with this, and I'm making it clear to you that this is really serious, so I can't let it go, and we can't reconnect. And it's basically swallowing poison and waiting for the other person to die. That's the supplicants. And then there is the people who are the survivors. And the survivors are people who are happy to get back to life and to resume normality. And to see this whole thing as a temporary state of insanity. This was crazy, this was mad, this was so painful. We don't talk about it anymore, and we resume. We have a life to live. We have a family to take care of, or all of that. And then the third group, I call them the explorers. And I'll read you a piece on the explorers in a sec. I think that will kind of give you a sense of how people repair. But the most important thing for me is this. When you are cheated on, my first question to you would be, what is your pain point? Where did this hurt to you the most? Is it who it was with? Is it the fact that you had been wanting him or her for so long, and she kept saying, I'm not, he kept saying, I'm not, I can't, I'm whatever, and then you find out that they are perfectly alive and well somewhere else? Is it the fact that there was love and that your partner literally fell in love with someone else and you know that they're back but they're still deeply longing for the other person and yearning for them? Where is the pain point? When you just say, I've been cheated on, I know nothing about you. I just know that your partner may have strayed in some form or another. I don't know if it's once. I don't know if it's repeated. I don't know if they promised you and they did it again. But the pain point is where you start, because that's what gets broken. One of the most interesting pain points I discovered was actually, when you pick a partner, you pick a story. And often you will be recruited for a play that you didn't audition for. That's marriage. People, when they choose, they also make a secret bargain with themselves. And one of the bargains that we sometimes make is, you're not one who's going to do this to me. I chose you especially for that. And I may even have related to you over the years as someone who is incapable of that. The predators, they're very hot, but they're not exactly the people you trust. You, I trust. And in the process of trusting you, I also have clipped your wings. I have rendered you inoffensive. And sometimes the betrayal is not because of what you did, it's because my bargain failed. The deal I made with myself that you may never have known you were even a part of. When people say, I don't trust, I always say, for what? You don't trust your partner to what? You still share the money, you still share the house, the children. There's so many things you continue to trust them for. You've never fully trusted them on everything. That's also a false notion. But for what? That they won't do it again, or that they would still want to be with you, or that they care deeply about you, or that they're so happy to be back? What is it that you need to know to trust? If you need to know the details to trust, then you're never going to trust, because trust is an active engagement with the unknown. It's a leap of faith. The more you need to know details, the less you trust. You're just a scavenger. You're trying to deal with your anxiety, with your fear, but it doesn't bring peace, calm, and trust and reassurance. So, let me read to you a piece about the explorers. I've been particularly interested in a third category of couples, those for whom the affair becomes a catalyst of transformation. These explorers come to see the infidelity as an event that, though insanely painful, contained the seeds of something positive. When faced with the collapse of the world they know, these couples home in on each other with a level of intensity that they haven't experienced in years. It's not uncommon for them to experience a combustive rekindling of desire that is a potent mixture of anxiety and lust. Fear of loss is the spark plug that sets it off. They're deeply engaged, in pain, but alive. The explorers have taught me so much about what lies at the core of resilient relationships. Madison and Dennis always struck me as being this kind of a couple. The uncovering of his affair threw them into turmoil, but I remember noting during our sessions that they had an uncanny ability to express and accept a wide range of feelings without demanding premature closure. Their tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty opened up a space for exploration in which they could more deeply reconnect. In contrast with the sufferers who conceive of their ideal in moral absolutes, the viewpoint of the explorers is more fluid. They more readily distinguish wrong from hurtful, paving a smoother road for clemency. Several years later, when I touched base with Dennis and Madison, they affirmed that they managed to sustain their wild swings without either one marching off to a divorce lawyer. Their grief revealed new facets of themselves and each other. Their first marriage was over. They would never get it back, but they could choose to have a second one. And in the process, they were able to turn the experience of infidelity into an enlarging emotional journey. When they speak about the affair, it is clear that they identify it as one event, not the definitive event in their long history together. One sign that they have successfully metabolized the events appears in their language. They shift from you and me to our. Madison doesn't talk about when you did this to me. Rather, they both talk about when we had our crisis, recounting a shared experience. Now they become joint scriptwriters, sharing credit for what they produce. What started outside the relationship is now housed within. For Madison and Dennis, the affair has become a landmark integrated into the broader geography of their lives together. Above all, they know that there are no clear-cut answers, so they're able to discuss the betrayal with a fundamental acceptance of their human flaws. Madison and Dennis's relationship feels much richer and more interesting, but it is also less secure. They have added novelty to the enduring, mystery to the familiar, and risk to the predictable. I'm not sure at all where all this is going to take us, but dull it certainly is not, Dennis says. If before they were facing dead ends, now they don't know where they'll end up. But that very fact is more exciting than frightening, and they are in it together. To repair is to repair. Are there more cards? Okay. I'm going to take this one to start. I can read them out loud to you. Comment on when the community and the couple or the intimacy are at odds. For example, in your podcast, there's a couple that married for 40 years. The husband was unfaithful for much of that time, and the wife is staying with him, but their family disapproves. You know, I get a lot of questions about the children, and my first question is always, how old are the children in your question? Because if it's a 3 or a 5-year-old, it's not going to be the same than it's people in their 30s, right? So it's a very interesting story here. This couple met when they were 15. They are together for 40 years. And they both tell me they had a good marriage. They have children, they have grandchildren, they have a whole social life. They had a good sexual relationship. That's not an issue. And she knows that he wasn't unhappy with her, but he was unhappy with himself and he had his own demons. Her children cannot accept that she is choosing to stay with him. Particularly one. They've decided she has Stockholm syndrome. And you know, that she doesn't know what that she doesn't have clarity of mind, that she doesn't know what she's doing. It's the same question about the one that you asked about staying for the children. You know, I think people have multiple reasons to make the decisions that they make about their relationships and their marriages. And I think one of the most important things for the community is not to dispense advice for consequences which you don't have to face. Do you understand? Let people figure it out. Guide them if you need them. On some occasion, just give them a couch. But we are not the ones who have to live with the consequences of those decisions. And there are many reasons to stay together. And sometimes the marriage itself is not the source of happiness, but the marriage gives access to multiple sources of happiness outside. And if people lose one thing, they need to give up the entire system. And they may not want to do that. And for all of you who have been the friends that know, that wonder, should you tell, shouldn't you tell, when you see, I mean, it's this whole, you know, it's the village. The most important thing for me is, and from when I listen to people, I always say, find 1 or 2 people. By the way, this is also to the question of what do you do when you've been cheated on. Find 1 or 2 people to confide in. You cannot live with this just by yourself in your own secret bubble. It's going to eat you up from the inside. It's going to breed shame in you for something that you don't have to feel shamed about, that you did nothing. And then when you think about the 2 people you want to confide in, they may not be your closest friends. But they are the ones who are more able to differentiate between their experience and yours and give you the space that you need to feel and think and figure things out. So that's the piece around that. There was another one here that I liked. What's one thing that a couple can do daily or weekly for their relationship? Tell each other something that they have never told each other before, so that they don't think that they've been around the block and there's nothing left to discover. That's 1. 2, touch each other a lot, because you can live without sex, but you can't live without touch. You become irritable, depressed, aggressive. You need touch. And some people are not good with words, but they're very good with their hands and with their smiles and with their eyes. Make sure to remind people that they're more than just a function, especially when you're in the stages where you are dealing heavily with management Inc. And don't just tell them what they need to do all the time, but just remind them who they are. And when you ask, how are you, make sure that they don't answer by how is the dog and how are the children, but that they actually get to think about them. And do things that make you feel alive, that bring pleasure, vitality, connection to your relationship. The quality of our relationships determines the quality of our lives, with or without this big experience. But that is the fundamental piece. I've said this at other times, but it's such a frame for me, I'm from Antwerp, Belgium, and from the Jewish community in Antwerp. It's all the Holocaust survivors in Antwerp. They all arrived after 45. And in my community, there are two groups of survivors: those who did not die and those who came back to life. The same with relationships. There are relationships that are not dead, and there are relationships that are thriving. It's not the same. When you think about what you want to do for your relationship, think big. Don't think reasonable, don't think rational, think big. Think about the things that make you feel alive. And that means that sometimes they are bold, they're out of character, they imply novelty, they imply risk. Small things. That doesn't have to be flying from the sky, but they're not just about making sure that you're stable, that you are anchored. You need anchor and you need waves. You need both dimensions. The relationships that thrive often are the ones that know how to reconcile security and adventure. And that also is the place where sustained desire can be found. What advice do I have for young therapists? I think I don't know, is there a timekeeper here for me? Huh? One more. Why don't you ask me one more from the audience? That's a real question, not a speech. Sorry? What is the relationship of commitment? Choice. These days, it's choice, renewed choice. Commitment is a lot of things, but fundamentally, since we have free choice today, and we're not majority probably here in arranged situations, the commitment is a renewed choice, a renewed sense of responsibility, a renewed sense of accountability towards one person and the family, the rest of the people. I think people renew their car licenses way more than they ever renew their vows. This marriage thing, people make it one time, 27, 32, whenever, and then it's supposed to just kind of live lifelong forever. I am very much for couples having all kinds of intermediate rituals where they renew their commitment and they redefine the relationship. At 45, at 65, at 85, you're not the same person. What do we want to be today? How do we want to live? What's our relationship? What are our boundaries? What's our monogamy agreement? What's our accountability? What is the degree of togetherness and separateness? Breeding relationships change. Every system that grows is a system that changes and that adapts to new conditions, internal and external conditions. Only marriage sometimes kind of wants to stay very consistent. So that's the definition. It's flexible, it's adaptive, it gets renewed, and I'm for those kinds of commitments. People do it anyway. But they do it mostly by changing partners. And what happens when you change partners is that often you still believe in the model. You just think you chose the wrong person and you'll do better next time. Rather than maybe the model applies for a period of your life and then you need a different model. When it comes to families, people understood that there are multiple models of families. There are commuter families, long-distance families, single-parent families, blended families, gay families, surrogate families. There's so many new models of families, but when it comes to coupledom, we are rather monolithic. It's like one model, and if you don't fit, you failed. And I really think that it's time that we not use longevity as the marker of success when it comes to coupledom. So, on my website, I have an intimacy inventory. That is basically the 10 questions that I think every person should ask themselves about relationships. I invite you to go do it. The rest you can find everything about me and what I do and this conversation online, on my website, estherperel.com. And what I really hope is that when you leave here, you use this to have conversations with each other, with whoever you came with whoever you meet after you go, that are different from the ones you would usually have. If you have a different conversation with those that you live with on the basis of what we talked here tonight, I will have done something useful. Thank you.